Okay, so let's get started with the next chapter, which is called 1998, Contact. And this 20-year time gap comes into play now. So this is the present for Lali, and she's living in London, and she makes contact with Pim, who is actually, his real name is Edgar, and she is Lali, but her real name is Letitia, and they make contact in London. And they meet up for dinner in Edgar's home with his kids and his wife is actually a little irritated with his intrusion into their life from this old friend of Pim's. There are a couple of things I want to pick up from the text. So the text will come up as I speak, and there's some highlighted bits that I just want to talk about. The first of those is this whole first meeting and their remembrance of 20 years previously, where they were called Lali and Pim, and they sort of awkwardly establish again that their names are actually Letitia and Edgar. And Sarah Penny uses this interesting Edgar who was Pim and Letitia who was Lali reference to who they are, and there's almost like when they connect again, there's a real yearning back for the time that was. And we see this over and over as Pim and Lali's relationship develops into a extramarital affair. We see that it's almost based on the past and on experiences that they've had in the past, and they're hankering back to that and trying to rekindle that. For Lali, it's the only real connection I sense where she has a sense of feeling something. She's largely grown up into an unemotional woman who doesn't really connect well with others or with people. She keeps her distance, and yet with Pim there's this strange connection that she feels. This bit about her father, when Pim apologizes or says sorry to hear about your father who has died, she says this interesting thing. She says, of course, there are social forms. And this tells us a heck of a lot about how Lali feels about her family, is particularly her father, and there's no real emotional connection there. She doesn't really even think of it, and yet she says, okay, well, this is something that has to be done because it's rude if you don't say sorry that someone's father has died. And then she comes back with a little congratulations and talks about that. The interesting thing about this short chapter under the subtitle Spuds and Lineage is this whole interplay between Ruth, the wife, and Lali, the old friend. Ruth can do amazing things with potatoes, and she's really irritated that Pim brings this up. And Lali says, I can't cook a thing. And later on, when Lali speaks to Mr. Greenbow, she says the same thing. And for Mr. Greenbow, as a married man, this is quite an attractive thing, that this woman can't cook a thing. And maybe for Pim, being settled and married, he's drawn to this Lali who is 35 and yet still freely can confess that she doesn't know how to cook. It's interesting a little bit later on where Ruth's feelings become apparent, and Ruth feels marginalized in her own home, and there's a sense that she feels out because it seems like she immediately recognizes and is probably irritated by the immediate connection that is between Pim and Lali again. We first really get a sense of what the connection is between Pim and Lali when she answers Pim's son about the farm that he's bragging about in Africa, and Lali says, yes, I know that farm. I used to visit there when I was your age. And we are suddenly aware again of the connection between Pim and Lali. If you look a little bit further on, and the page reference will be there for you, for your books, the author writes this, or the narrator writes this about Lali. She has not, in fact, visited her farm in over 5 years. Her farm is an envelope of figures which she receives each month from the manager because her widowed mother, since re-established in town, is now too elderly and blighted to take an interest. Lali isn't interested either, but the manager is a man full of duty. And so here's this place, you know, the place where you grow up, or the place where your family is from, that should be a place with great memories, and yet there's no connection for Lali. And we pick that up again later in the novel, and I'll talk about that later. But there's absolutely no connection for Lali to her past. And as the novel progresses, clearly no connection to her father, and clearly no connection really to her mother. And there are real issues here for Lali. Real issues from her childhood, issues of rejection, of feeling alone and lonely. And we realize that fairly quickly. We also have insight into Pim's past. It says here that Pim is not unconscious of the heavy weight of history, the contravention of first principles that occurs when a Pim-destined farm is managed by Michael. And Michael's younger brother manages the farm, which should have been his. Pim should have taken the farm. It was his birthright as the eldest, and yet he decides to contravene that. And this is a novel where there's a lot of tension between what should be, and we see that later with Shuttleworth and the homosexual encounter. We see that later when Lali is embraced by the Sisi. There's this thing about how things should be, the rigid, apartheid, predetermined way of living, and then people who have decided, like Pim, like Lali, like others, to actually rock that way of life and move away from it and move beyond it. But there is a sense of burden, of weight, of possibly guilt on both Pim and Lali for the things that they don't do and they're not connected to. We'll look in the next short tutorial. We'll look at Lali's schooling life and be introduced to that. Flashback to 1978 in the chapter Standard 8, Body Dolls and Earthworms.